For years, Hollywood believed some records were untouchable. Not because they were protected by contracts or copyrights, because they belonged to legends. The kind of films that don't simply dominate theaters, they define generations. The kind of movies parents introduce to their children with the same excitement they once felt sitting in a packed cinema decades earlier. One of those legends has always been The Lord of the Rings, a trilogy that didn't just win Oscars. It changed filmmaking forever. Its massive worldwide success became the measuring stick for fantasy cinema, blockbuster storytelling, and the power of event movies. So when headlines suddenly began suggesting that a film called Michael had achieved something nobody expected, the entire entertainment industry stopped to look. Because this wasn't supposed to happen. Not this fast. Not against one of the most beloved franchises in modern history. At first, many people assumed it was clickbait. Others dismissed it as another social media exaggeration. But then the numbers kept coming. Opening weekend. International markets. Audience scores. Ticket sales. Premium format screenings. Every new report painted the same picture. Something extraordinary was happening. And it wasn't just another successful movie. It was becoming a cultural event. An event powerful enough to force Hollywood executives, Wall Street analysts, theater owners, and longtime movie fans into the very same conversation. How did a biographical film, one surrounded by years of controversy, production delays, expensive rewrites, and enormous public skepticism, suddenly become one of the biggest stories in modern box office history? That's the question everyone wanted answered. Because behind every massive box office number lies another story. A story about expectations, risk, timing, public emotion, and sometimes, a story about redemption. Long before audiences ever bought their first ticket, Michael had already become one of the most talked about productions in Hollywood. Not because cameras had started rolling, but because nearly every creative decision surrounding the project carried enormous pressure. Telling the story of Michael Jackson was never going to be simple. Few entertainers have ever inspired the level of admiration, influence, controversy, and debate that surrounded the King of Pop. To millions, he remains one of the greatest performers in music history. His records shattered sales milestones. His concerts became global events. His choreography transformed popular culture. His influence reached generations of artists across every continent. Yet alongside that extraordinary success came decades of controversy that fundamentally changed how many people viewed his legacy. Every filmmaker considering a Michael Jackson biopic faced the same impossible question. How do you tell one of entertainment's biggest stories without igniting another worldwide controversy? That challenge haunted the production from the very beginning. Reports over several years described delays, script revisions, legal complications, and intense public scrutiny as the filmmakers attempted to balance artistic storytelling with one of the most complex public legacies in entertainment history. Then came another surprise. Rather than casting a globally famous Hollywood superstar, the filmmakers selected Jaffer Jackson, Michael Jackson's nephew, to portray the legendary performer. It was an unconventional decision. Some fans immediately embraced the choice because of the physical resemblance. Others remained deeply skeptical. Could anyone truly recreate one of history's greatest entertainers? Could any actor capture the voice, the movement, the energy, the mystery? For months, those questions dominated online discussions. Every leaked production photo generated millions of views. Every behind-the-scenes image sparked another wave of comparisons. Some viewers believed the resemblance was astonishing. Others argued no performance could ever satisfy audiences with such deeply personal memories of Michael Jackson. Meanwhile, the production itself continued growing more expensive. Industry reports suggested significant rewrites and reshoots increased the film's overall cost, turning the project into one of the largest financial bets ever placed on a musical biopic. The pressure wasn't simply creative anymore. It became financial. Hundreds of millions of dollars were effectively riding on one question. Would audiences actually show up? Inside Hollywood, Predictions varied dramatically. Some analysts expected a respectable opening. Others feared controversy would permanently limit the movie's commercial appeal. A few believed nostalgia alone could make it successful. Almost nobody predicted what happened next. Because when opening weekend finally arrived, the numbers shocked nearly everyone. According to verified box office reporting, Michael opened to roughly $97 million domestically and more than $217 million worldwide, setting the biggest opening ever for a biographical film and the largest debut for a musical biopic. Within hours, trade publications began rewriting their headlines. Analysts who had underestimated the movie scrambled to update projections. Financial forecasts changed almost overnight. Movie theaters added additional showings. Premium IMAX screenings became major contributors to the opening weekend performance, itself another record for a musical biopic. But that wasn't what truly fascinated Hollywood. Big openings happen. They're exciting. They're newsworthy. Yet many fade almost as quickly as they arrive. What interested executives was something else entirely. Audience behavior. Critics had been divided. General audiences, however, responded far more enthusiastically, creating one of the widest gaps between critical reviews and audience reactions in recent memory. That difference mattered, because history has repeatedly shown that when audiences become emotionally invested in a movie, strong word of mouth can dramatically extend its theatrical run, and suddenly, another possibility entered the conversation. What if this wasn't just a record-breaking opening? What if it was only the beginning? That possibility triggered a wave of comparisons few expected, not simply against other biopics, not even against recent blockbusters, but against some of the most celebrated franchises ever released, including The Lord of the Rings. Yet here's where the story becomes far more complicated than many viral headlines suggest. Exactly which record was Michael beating? Was it an opening weekend milestone? An IMAX benchmark? A genre-specific achievement? Or was social media combining different records into one sensational narrative? The answer changes everything. Because separating genuine achievements from internet exaggeration may reveal an even more fascinating story than the headlines themselves. The moment the headlines broke, something familiar happened in Hollywood. Not celebration, not disbelief, but confusion. Because the phrase spreading across social media was not careful, not measured, and definitely not industry standard. It was absolute. Michael just beat The Lord of the Rings. No qualifiers. No category. No explanation of what record was supposedly broken. Just a statement that sounded too big to ignore and too vague to trust. Inside studio offices, executives didn't react with excitement. They reacted the way they always do when viral narratives start outrunning verified reporting. They open the numbers. Not tweets. Not TikTok edits. Not influencer breakdowns. The actual box office dashboards. And what they found told a very different story than the internet was suggesting. Because The Lord of the Rings, depending on which metric you choose, sits in multiple tiers of box office history. Adjusted global earnings. Original theatrical run totals. Franchise-wide performance. Re-releases that quietly added millions over time. It's not a single number you beat. It's a layered legacy of financial milestones built over decades. So when analysts looked at Michael, they weren't asking whether it had won. They were asking something far more precise. What exactly are people comparing? And that question exposed the first fracture in the viral story. Because Michael, despite its explosive opening, was not competing in the same category as a multi-film fantasy trilogy that defined an entire cinematic era. It was competing in a narrower lane, biographical musical drama. And in that lane, something genuinely remarkable was happening. The film wasn't just performing well domestically. It was over-indexing internationally in markets that traditionally respond unpredictably to Western music biopics. According to early reporting from trade publications, overseas turnout surged far beyond initial projections. driven largely by younger audiences discovering Michael Jackson's legacy through streaming-era nostalgia cycles rather than theatrical memory. WSJ.com. That detail mattered, because it reframed the entire conversation. This wasn't just a nostalgia play. It was the cross-generational rediscovery event. But even that didn't explain the intensity of the viral reaction. Somewhere between official reporting and social media amplification, a simple truth became distorted into something larger than itself. The film had set records, but category-specific ones. Biggest opening for a musical biopic. One of the strongest global debuts for its genre. A performance that exceeded internal studio projections by a significant margin. Yet online, those distinctions collapsed. And in their place emerged a single simplified narrative. It beat The Lord of the Rings. Not because the numbers said so, but because audiences were responding emotionally, not technically. And that is where modern box office culture becomes unpredictable. Because in the streaming era, perception moves faster than verification. A film doesn't just earn money. It earns momentum. It earns identity. It earns a story people want to believe while they're still watching it unfold. Inside that momentum, Michael became something more than a movie release. It became a debate. Was this a genuine cultural reset for theatrical music storytelling? Or was it another case of online exaggeration inflating a strong opening into a mythical achievement? The divide widened when critics' responses entered the conversation. Some praised the performance at the center of the film, pointing to its emotional ambition and technical recreation of iconic stage moments. Others questioned whether any biopic of Michael Jackson could ever escape the weight of expectation, given the decades of public scrutiny surrounding his life. That split created something the industry recognizes instantly: volatility. And volatility is what turns box office performance into headline warfare, because now the story wasn't just about revenue. It was about interpretation. Every chart became a battleground. Every ranking became contested space. And every new update was treated like evidence in a trial that no one officially agreed was happening. Meanwhile, theaters saw something far more grounded. Packed screenings in major cities. Strong repeat attendance in select demographics. Premium format demand holding longer than expected for a biographical release. But also sharp drop-offs in regions where word of mouth remained mixed. Both realities existed at the same time. And both were being used online to support completely opposite narratives. This is where the comparison to The Lord of the Rings became emotionally powerful, but analytically fragile. Because The Lord of the Rings represents cultural permanence, while Michael, at this stage, represented early cycle momentum. One is a legacy measured in decades. The other is a story still being written in real time, and yet the internet rarely waits for complete stories. It prefers conclusions, even when the evidence is still forming. Back in industry circles, the real focus wasn't on whether a fantasy trilogy had been beaten. It was on a more uncomfortable question. Why did this specific comparison catch fire at all? Why that franchise? Why this film? And why now? The answer wasn't found in spreadsheets. It was found in audience psychology. Because when people see a cultural icon like Michael Jackson reinterpreted on a global cinematic scale, they don't process it as a normal release. They process it as an event with historical weight. Something that feels like it belongs in the same conversation as the biggest stories ever told in cinema. Even when the numbers don't technically align. And that gap between emotional perception and statistical reality is exactly where viral narratives are born. Not from lies, but from compression. From turning complex industry data into simple, emotionally satisfying statements. And once that happens, the truth has to work twice as hard to catch up. By the third wave of headlines, the story had already changed shape again. What began as a box office comparison had now turned into something else entirely. A cultural argument. A generational divide playing out in real time across screens, comment sections, and entertainment panels that couldn't agree on what they were even measuring anymore. Some outlets were careful. They spoke in categories. Musical biopic records. opening weekend benchmarks, international performance trends. But online, nuance doesn't travel well. Emotion does. And emotion had already decided what this story was supposed to mean. Somewhere in the noise, the phrase, "Michael beat the Lord of the Rings," stopped being a claim and started becoming a symbol. A symbol of disruption, of legacy being challenged, of something old supposedly being replaced by something new. Even if that new was not actually new at all, but a reinterpretation of a global icon whose influence had never truly faded from public consciousness. Inside the industry, analysts tried to regain control of the narrative the only way they could, by narrowing the lens. They began breaking the performance down into segments that rarely make viral headlines but define real financial success. Domestic versus international splits. Premium format contributions. Second-week retention curves. Per-screen averages in major markets. When viewed through that lens, Michael wasn't a mystery. It was a case study in modern theatrical behavior. Strong opening demand driven by curiosity. A second wave of attendance fueled by social media debate. And then the most important metric of all, how long audiences stayed interested once the initial excitement faded. That last part was where the conversation became less glamorous. Because early data suggested a familiar pattern in today's blockbuster ecosystem, front-loaded enthusiasm, followed by stabilization, then normalization. Not collapse, not dominance, something far more common. A leveling. But even that analytical clarity couldn't compete with what was happening outside industry circles. Because while studios were studying trends, audiences were building narratives. And narratives don't care about retention curves. They care about meaning. In fan communities, Michael wasn't being discussed like a standard release. It was being treated like a referendum on cultural memory itself. For older audiences, the film represented a return to an era when Michael Jackson dominated global pop culture without competition. For younger viewers, it was an introduction, filtered through modern cinematic language, streaming-era attention spans, and a constant expectation of spectacle. That generational split created something unpredictable. Different emotional stakes, different definitions of success, and different thresholds for what record-breaking even means. One group saw historical continuity. The others saw reinvention. And in that clash, the comparison to The Lord of the Rings gained traction again, not because it was precise, but because it was emotionally legible. Everyone understands what The Lord of the Rings represents. Epic scale. Cinematic achievement. A benchmark of franchise filmmaking that still echoes through modern blockbusters. So invoking it wasn't really about numbers. It was about stature. And stature is far more persuasive online than data. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, the film's performance was being evaluated in a much colder language. Revenue trajectories, marketing efficiency, international conversion rates, and long-term profitability forecasts tied to streaming licensing and post-theatrical demand. Because theatrical success today doesn't end at the box office. It continues into digital windows, platform deals, and global catalog value. And Michael, according to early projections, was shaping up to have a second financial life beyond cinemas, one that could stabilize or even extend its overall profitability regardless of theatrical fluctuations. That detail rarely appears in viral discussions. But it's often what determines whether a film is considered a success years later. Still, none of that complexity stopped the online argument from escalating. Clips circulated showing packed theaters. Others showed empty seats in specific regions. Some users framed it as proof of dominance. Others as evidence of exaggeration. Both sides were using isolated moments to represent a global outcome. And in that fragmented interpretation, the truth became harder to locate, not because it disappeared, but because it was being viewed through incompatible lenses. At the center of it all, the comparison to The Lord of the Rings continued to resurface like a magnet pulling unrelated conversations into the same orbit. But the deeper analysts looked, the clearer the distinction became. One franchise was a multi-film global ecosystem built over years. reshaped by re-releases, awards momentum, and long-tail cultural embedding. The other was a single-release phenomenon navigating modern volatility, social media amplification, and genre-specific expectations. They weren't rivals. They weren't even in the same structural category. But in the attention economy, structure matters less than story. And the story that stuck was simple enough to spread, even if it wasn't precise enough to fully trust. A new contender had entered the conversation. Whether it truly won was no longer the point. Because once a narrative reaches that scale, the comparison becomes permanent, even after the facts are clarified. And that is where the real tension begins. Not in what the film earned, but in what people believe it represents. And in Hollywood, belief has always been the most powerful currency of all.